How Midakiapi, all my relations in English. Ampetu de chante wishtea iyuha na pe cheyuzapado. It's with the good hand that I meet you and greet you in my language. My name is Tom Goldtooth. I am the Executive Director of the Indigenous Environmental Network. I am both with the Southern Dene, or better known as the Navajo or Dene, and with the Bidewa-Kantawan, Dakota in Minnesota. So last year, at the 22nd session of this forum, our Indigenous Environmental Network made an intervention here, requesting the forum for a special session to address climate fault solutions, the green economy, and their impacts on Indigenous peoples. The request included a moratorium on all fault solution activities until affected Indigenous peoples from the south to the north can thoroughly investigate the impacts and make appropriate demands. The expert group meeting on Indigenous peoples in the green economy did take place a couple months ago in January. The meeting was a starting point. However, there are key issues that still remain. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its is the scientific climate reports that have stated for over 20 years, calling for a dramatic reduction of CO2 emissions to begin as soon as possible. I have been directly involved in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I will call that UNFIII in my introduction here. I have been involved with the UNFIII Conference of the Parties since 1998. Our network has compiled over 20 years of undeniable evidence showing how carbon markets, pricing, and carbon offsets mechanisms do not reduce emissions at source. Carbon markets provide the loophole that many of you have talked to us about. They provide the loophole the fossil fuel industry needs to continue extraction, combustion, and with a fossil extractive economy that is wrecking the harmony of Mother Earth and Father Sky. We are long overdue for demanding a permanent moratorium on fault solutions being negotiated in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The UNFIII has goals to finalize these negotiations this year. After 2 decades of polluters profiting from causing human rights violations, land grabbing, and division, harm, and exploiting Indigenous peoples through carbon markets and REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. It is time now to hear from our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Tamara Gilbertson, an activist, researcher, and scholar working to dismantle the local, national, subnational, and international policy barriers to achieve climate justice, including carbon markets, carbon offsets, clean development mechanisms, climate finance, and gender, inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, and racial and social justice. As a U.S. Fulbright recipient, she conducted research on carbon markets, coal mining, and conservation impacts in the Caribbean regions of Colombia. She was previously a founder and co-director of Carbon Trade Watch and former project coordinator of the Environmental Justice Project of the Transnational Institute. Tamara is the coordinator of the Climate Justice Program of the Indigenous Environmental Network. Tamara, please.
Say that we've never seen anything like this. The decisions are still being made now, and we're following this very closely. I'll try not to get too policy wonky here, but it's really important to go over some of these key areas. After more than 20 years of evidence of the inherently flawed carbon markets, we are here to say no more. No more to voluntary carbon markets, but also no to Article 6. We are deeply concerned about the build-out of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement because it will consist of never-seen-before linked global carbon markets, which are due to be completed by November of this year at COP29 in Azerbaijan. Placing the hopes of mitigating climate change into a system of market volatility, boom and bust cycles, and financialized markets is not a responsible or accountable act. We simply do not have time for more carbon markets or more building out of carbon markets, for REDD+ and for more geoengineering schemes. Building out more experimental carbon markets does not keep fossil fuels in the ground. Let me start with Article 6.8 today. This is what's considered the non-market-based approaches, or the NMAs, and these rules were finalized at COP28 in Dubai last year. We have very big concerns about what this will look like because it's a web-based platform that will require a login address or a password that's not accessible to observers or researchers. It's only accessible, of course, to countries or parties to the UNFCCC or to the private sector that wants to bid on a natural area. So countries can put up a region and say that they are looking for funding, and then that region, then those private sector financiers or conservation NGOs or whatnot can then bid and say we can give this much money to quote unquote preserve that area. But what our main concern about this, not just the transparency of the web-based platform, but even further is what are the regions? Whose regions are these? What people are living in these regions? We're seeing laws and policies change now in countries in the global south to perhaps change laws about national parks where Indigenous peoples live to not allow people to live anymore in national parks. And so this concerns us and how Article 6.8 is going to play out, and it's something and a key research area I really hope that we can work together on because we don't know what this is going to look like. This is being built now. In Bonn in June, they plan to launch the web-based platform, so please keep an eye on that. Article 6.4, as I mentioned earlier, is will take over from the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. There are several areas here that are deeply troubling, and we have been, tirelessly adding submissions upon submissions to the supervisory body of Article 6.4 over the last few years. One of the things that we're noting is the Sustainable Development Tool. That's the new language for what will take over as safeguards and other sort of quote-unquote benefit-sharing areas. There is an open call for that right now that ends on April 22nd for people who want to add any cautions to the supervisory body. And we have really huge concerns about how rights of free, prior, and informed consent, as enshrined by the UN DRIP, is not included in the Sustainable Development Tool. What's more inside of Article 6.4 and very troubling, which my colleagues will speak about more, are what's called carbon dioxide removals, or CDR, which is a methodological area that includes two major parts. One is biological removals, which many of us understand as forest offsets, or now moving into agriculture, soil offsets, ocean offsets, and my other colleagues will talk about animal offsets and many other things. Really bonkers stuff. And then the other side of this is engineered offsets, or what we're seeing a massive build out in the United States for carbon capture and storage, CO2 pipelines, hydrogen, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and a lot of money coming out of the DOE, or the Department of Energy right now, under the Biden administration's IRA, or Inflation Reduction Plan, to fund these programs like CCS, in order to basically get them ready for when Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is ready, to sort of be able to then use those as the United States, part of the United States NDC, or nationally determined contribution, which would then fall under Article 6.2. Article 6.2 is what's called the registry database, which is where they'll track the NDCs. And for countries that reduce what they say underneath their contribution or their NDC, that extra can then be used as something called an ITMO, or an internationally transferred mitigation outcome, to be then traded across borders. So we're looking at quite a lot of big issues here and how they're expanding carbon markets and expanding the process. It's not anything new, in the sense that it's a lot of the same type of scams that allow the fossil fuel industries to claim that they've reduced emissions when in fact they haven't. And I just want to end by saying that ending fossil fuels, or keeping fossil fuels in the ground, means ending carbon markets and false solutions. These loopholes allow for combustion, extraction, transport of fossil fuels. And if we're serious about an Indigenous just transition, a just transition, then we must end the loopholes now. Ending fossil fuels means ending carbon markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. Thank you for your presentation. In my travels, cross-cutting issues like energy issues, agriculture, and now human rights, and the issues of rights of Indigenous peoples, that many of my dialogues around climate policy related to market systems and geoengineering technologies that are getting a lot of media attention, is that a lot of people say it's complex. It's above the head, you could say, of people that are concerned about climate. And I find that's very true, even from some of the non-governmental organizations, major ones that I attend meetings with at the Conference of the Parties. Very few of them fully understand the depth of the concerns that we are talking about. Some of them have advisors of other sister organizations of NGOs that specialize more on this issue. So that's, I appreciate your patience as we share some of our observations, in our requests and our urgency, asking for the permanent forum to really raise issues and concerns and questions about these market regimes that do not cut emissions at source and violate the rights of Indigenous peoples. Our next speaker is Alberto Saldamondo. Alberto is Chicano, Zapoteca, and is an internationally acknowledged expert on human and Indigenous rights, representing Indigenous peoples, organizations, and communities from various countries, from many regions of the world, before the United Nations and other international human rights bodies, including but not limited to the International Labor Organization, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Previously to being the General Counsel of the Indigenous Environmental Network on International Climate Policy and Human Rights, Alberto served as General Counsel of the International Indian Treaty Council for 18 years, and is very proud of his very active participation in the negotiations leading to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the establishment of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Alberto is an expert on the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, Indigenous Rights and Human Rights. Alberto, please.
Dealt with the technicalities of the Paris Agreement, but it might be interesting to go over a little bit of history first. The Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in 1992. That means that you had to have a lead-in of several years, maybe 10 or 20 years, even before you had a convention drafted. If we had followed the science at that time, we would be facing a very different climate that we have today. If we had followed the science that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had given the advice to the initial conference of parties, if they had followed the science, we would still have a much better climate to deal with, and the climate catastrophes, I don't believe, would be as disastrous as they are today. Initially, the Kyoto Protocol called for a mandatory reduction of emissions. That is, the leading polluters were bound by the law, at least within the Framework Convention, to reduce their emissions to a certain extent. States like the United States and others reduced, as it is a political process, reduced their obligations to reduce their emissions, and then they didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol. Then it turned out that nobody was following the reduction of emissions. So they said, well, if you're not going to be bound by the law, maybe you can tell us what you're willing to do. And those are the national determined contributions. So now we're faced with the decisions based on what the states are willing to do and not what the climate requires. Within the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there is one article on markets, and they don't even call them markets. They call them ITMOs, they call them other things, but they don't identify these as markets, at least in terms of the convention. But that is the heart of the, at least the Paris Agreement and the convention really, is to reduce emissions to a safe level. But within Article 6 is maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs long, maybe 8 paragraphs long, but the convention itself is 232 articles. But they saved that one piece. That one piece of the markets is really what the heart of that agreement. As currently drafted, the articles, and it has a supervisory body just for Article 6. Not the CMP3 does not cover the entire convention, but there's a separate governing body just for Article 6, the implementation of the market system. So, I mean, that's the important part, and that's the part that is just a really small part of the whole convention. As currently drafted, the Article 6 supervisory body recommendation for activities involving removals, and we're talking about removals here, taking the carbon out of the air. Under Article 6.4, mechanism does not in any way acknowledge or consider the collective rights of indigenous peoples or adequately fulfill the supervisory body's obligation to ensure and protect those rights. Under the Decision 3/CMA.3, the supervisory body has clear and express obligation to establish the requirements and processes necessary to operate the Article 6 mechanism in a manner that, quote, respects, promotes, and considers human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples. Section 3B of Decision 3/CMA.3, Annex Governance and Functions, provides that the supervisory body shall, in accordance with relevant decisions of the CMA, establish the requirements and processes necessary to operate the mechanisms relating to, inter alia, the 11th preambular paragraph of the Paris Agreement to minimize and, where possible, avoid negative environmental and social impacts. This includes the removals of carbon dioxide, the anthropogenic activities that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and ensure its long-term storage in terrestrial, geological, or ocean reservoirs, or in long-lasting products. We have there's a scheme to take the carbon and make things out of it, like maybe titanium, computers. We have heard among many moving concerns about mining on indigenous lands. Removals on tar sands, as an example, not only contribute to offsets, allowing the oil business as usual, but give rise to the loss of self-determination and sovereignty by tribal governments and create cancers in stillborn babies, chronically ill babies, and chronically ill populations of indigenous peoples, and they break in the spiritual and material relationship with their lands, their ceremony, song, and languages, affecting them and generations yet to come. And these tribes that have are litigating the tar sands. Their lawsuit has been delayed for 10 years that allows the destruction to continue. The supervisory body's proposed draft recommendations ostensibly seek to avoid or minimize negative environmental and social impacts of removal activities, but the draft recommendation does not do so expressly with respect to indigenous peoples, taking into account their unique status and unique rights. The supervisory body has an express obligation to develop standards, processes, and requirements that comply with the preambular paragraph of the Paris Agreement as it relates to the rights of indigenous peoples. The collective rights of indigenous peoples are set forth with specificity in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They include, but are not limited to, the right of self-determination, the right to lands, territories, and resources, and the right to free, prior, and informed consent in connection with consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples through their representative institutions prior to approval, commencement, and during the implementation of any project that may affect their lands, territories, and other resources. In fact, it's Article 6 that is the problem, working in opposition to the very purpose of the UNFCCC to reduce man-made greenhouse gas emissions and carbon pollution. Both Article 6.2 and 6.4 call for carbon markets that can be applied to a state's nationally determined contributions or whatever they're willing to chip in, or bought in an open market for use by industries whose carbon emissions have been limited by their own national laws. We have witnessed negotiations of Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement's attempt to include an appeals and grievance process. The supervisory body began by insisting that there should be a high fee for all stakeholders, including indigenous peoples, in order to file a grievance, and only allow those stakeholders who are part of the carbon offsets projects to submit the grievance. We insist that there must be a process for impacted indigenous peoples and carbon offset projects to submit grievances without cost. It is glaringly obvious that the supervisory body is making this a difficult process because they may fear the potential number of complaints. We have all seen how the RED, or reductions of emissions from deforestation and degradation of forest, have worked to deny indigenous peoples their collective rights. There are some among us who are accepting REDs, that is, among us within this meeting of the Permanent Forum, are accepting RED, perhaps feeling that it will come anyway and they could use the money. But they are in fact selling their trees and lands on which they rest. REDs is a land grab, whereby the use of the forest is severely limited, sometimes even in the gathering of medicinal plants and hunting and fishing rights. The rights of free, prior, and informed consent is lost, as is the sovereign right and self-determination of indigenous peoples. The supervisory body of Article 6 has asked for indigenous peoples' inputs on several occasions, but when we respond, they don't acknowledge our submission, they don't acknowledge our inputs or use them in their draft, and just tell us to give them more inputs. They ignore our submissions and recommendations, but it is due to the unique risk profile of indigenous peoples that the inherent flaw of carbon markets and respect of Mother Earth that the Indigenous Environmental Network requests the UN Permanent Forum to recommend to the UNFCCC, the UN Conference on Biological Diversity, and other institutions to issue a permanent moratorium, a stop on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, all carbon markets, offsets, carbon dioxide removals, geoengineering, RED+, and the debt caused by financial mechanisms such as by the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. Our next speaker has traveled here a long ways. She comes from community. She comes from Amazon of Acre, Brazil. She's a youth under the UN guidelines of being a youth, and she's here, but she already has a wealth of experience. So we welcome Dr. Sherilini Oliveira da Silva Hunaquai. She's an indigenous activist and scholar from the Amazon, and she has her PhD from the university in British Columbia, and she specializes in indigenous peoples, human rights, and the issues of international cooperation. She also has worked for the Federation of the Hunaquai Peoples and the Indigenous Agroforestry Movement Association in Acre. In her years of work, which has crossed many different issues, she's worked related to sustainable agriculture, indigenous land management, and agroforestry. So I'm turning it over to you, Sherilini. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. I speak in Portuguese. Nos últimos anos, a crise climática tem se aprofundado e ganhado impactos devastadores em todo o mundo. As mudanças climáticas são impulsionadas principalmente pelas emissões de gases de efeito estufa resultante da queima de combustíveis fósseis e de gases do efeito estufa, do desmatamento, da agricultura intensiva e de outras atividades humanas. Os efeitos da crise climática são muitos, incluindo o aumento das temperaturas globais, o derretimento das calotas polares e dos glaciares, além do aumento do nível do mar, os eventos climáticos cada vez mais extremos e frequentes, sendo intensos, as temperaturas, as secas, as inundações que têm afetado as comunidades tradicionais, os incêndios florestais e as alterações nos padrões de precipitações. Essas mudanças têm sérias consequências para o meio ambiente, a biodiversidade, a segurança, a saúde pública e a economia global. Comunidades vulneráveis, como povos indígenas, populações de baixa renda e países em desenvolvimento, são os mais afetados, enfrentando deslocamentos forçados, escassez de recursos naturais e aumento da insegurança alimentar, além de afetar espaços e elementos sagrados para os povos indígenas e interferir diretamente na sua cultura e nos seus modos de vida. Apesar das discussões em grandes conferências internacionais para reduzir as emissões de gases de efeito estufa, como o Acordo de Paris, mostram que esses compromissos têm sido insuficientes para limitar o aquecimento global a níveis seguros. É emergencial que os governos, as empresas e a humanidade adotem medidas urgentes para mitigar as mudanças climáticas, promovendo a transição para fontes de energia limpa, investindo em tecnologias sustentáveis, conservando ecossistemas naturais e adotando práticas agrícolas mais sustentáveis, aproveitando saberes tradicionais de baixo impacto e utilizados por povos tradicionais e indígenas. Um dos maiores desafios dos programas e das políticas de redução como as políticas dos programas de rede, são as questões de governança e de corrupção que se escondem por trás desse programa. Em alguns casos, os fundos destinados a essas políticas vêm sendo mal utilizados a níveis governamentais locais. Isso pode resultar em projetos mal geridos, que não alcançam seus objetivos de conservação e não beneficiam adequadamente as comunidades locais. Outro ponto importante é o foco excessivo em carbono, ignorando outros serviços ecossistêmicos, como a biodiversidade, a conservação da água, o sustento das comunidades locais e a preservação cultural. A apropriação por particulares e por terceiros dos territórios e das comunidades, que podem legitimar a apropriação de terras por particulares. Muitas vezes isso pode custar às comunidades locais e aos povos indígenas a perda ou o controle e o acesso às comunidades e aos seus territórios tradicionais e recursos naturais. Os povos indígenas declararam que seus modos de vida estão afetados, que não conseguiremos viver muitos anos se continuarmos com esta tendência e estamos colocando as futuras gerações em risco. Isso é uma emergência climática. Obrigada.
Thank you. We're going to be honored with their chief and spiritual leader that will be coming from her community, Ninawa, Chief Ninawa. He is coming here this Sunday. Those of you that have heard his interventions, he's been very concerned of the overall deliberations of the countries of the world that are talking about mitigation of the climate crisis. And he told me in Glasgow, when we were together a couple meetings ago, that the world leaders are forgetting one important concept and positioning is the spiritual relationship to the Mother Earth, the spiritual relationship to the air that we breathe and the Father Sky. And that if world leaders don't incorporate the spiritual values, the cosmovision of indigenous peoples in seeking solution, that they're going to be missing the importance of what needs to be done. And I agreed with him. I agreed with him on this. Very important, because in our work in the Indigenous Environmental Network, there are expectations from the many indigenous leaders and spiritual peoples and practitioners of our traditional indigenous ways to be accountable, to talk with them, to consult with them. What is your opinion about these discussions that are taking place? I remember one of my elders warned me years ago when I started to work on environmental protection issues in 1990. And he pulled me aside and said, Takoja, grandson, in this work you do, it's very good. Environmental protection, environmental health, and linking it to the rights of our indigenous peoples. He said, if there's anything you come across where it is hard to translate it into our tribal language, into the indigenous language, you gotta be concerned and watch out. I thought about that years later in 1998, coming out of a gathering that we had in the United States, bringing elected tribal government leaders, tribal program that work on environmental protection. We advocated that the traditional practitioners from our communities, our nations, and our spiritual leaders and our community-based organizations need to be at that meeting. And this was highlighted as well. And it was only a couple of years from 1998 I began to to find that there is such a creature taking place that is hard to translate. The seriousness of ownership when we bring carbon into a market system, it's a question of property rights. Who owns that carbon is able to trade carbon, to trade the air. That's a foreign concept to many indigenous peoples I've talked to. I follow some of the NGOs that work on this. They do workshops with relatives in the jungles of the Amazon or the tropics. And I follow some of those trainings and workshops when I can, or associate. And I ask them one question: did they tell you where that money comes from? And they kind of pause. They say, yeah, it's the World Bank. I said, did you know that comes from Chevron? It comes from Shell. It comes from the polluting industry, and they're appalled that no one told them that the money comes from the polluters for RED, for nature-based solutions, for carbon offsets. Allows the greenwashing of fossil fuels. So I just wanted to say that piece. Our next speaker is going to speak on another link to climate fault solutions, is that's geoengineering technologies, but also including manipulation of the stratosphere, of solar radiation modification and manipulation, or so-called management. And some of the things that she had to address way up in Alaska with the Arctic Ice Project, for an example. Again, raising serious questions around consultation or failures of free, prior, and informed consent. Palanga Hungowi is a member of the St. Lawrence Yupik peoples in Alaska and within the Bering Strait. She is a tribal healer, a birthing doula, and worked for a decade on the issues of systemic oppression and historical trauma and indigenous peoples in Alaska and indigenous rights. She is an engineering organizer with the Indigenous Environmental Network, focusing on the increasing threat posed by highly speculative large-scale carbon removal technologies, solar radiation modification, marine geoengineering, and other geoengineering experimentation. Palanga, please.
Wanga aka banganga ng naka bangawi, wanga ataka agnaterma naka Kirsten Nugak Pas, wanga sivunga kami from Sivuka on St. Lawrence Island, and my Ramka or my clan is the Kiwagami. I want to thank my Maori sister here for sharing information with us, and I have a Maori relative who came up to Alaska, and I actually start out with some of his words. He came and visited us when I was a young organizer, and his name is Bentham Ohai, and he said, what counts as knowledge, what knowledge counts, and who decides? And then he replaced that with other words. So I want to ask you, what counts as power? What power counts? And who decides? So St. Lawrence Island, we are sometimes referred to as the most polluted people in the world. We are highly contaminated by both a history of experiments with radioactive iodine injection and by an intentional chemical and fuel spill by the military on our Northeast Cape. Additionally, all world toxics travel north by current, and we are one of 2 thoroughways to the Arctic. Our peoples have a long history of being both the stepping stool and the dumping ground of modern science and Western society. The climate crisis was born out of an imbalance of power, the forced colonization and dehumanization of peoples. The only way we have been permitted to over-emit fossil fuels is by the use of indigenous lands, bodies, trees, and air as sacrifice zones. It is a broken relationship between peoples and the forgotten understanding that we are nature. We are not separate, and the more harm we cause to our mother, the more harm we cause to ourselves and each other. Colonization, patriarchy, white supremacy, militarism, capitalism, and an extraction-based economy have stolen relationship and natural order and replaced it with a system of power and control. All of these unnatural ways of being work together to sustain each other. Indigenous peoples have been in good relationship with the land for time immemorial and have managed to protect over 80% of what is left of Earth's biodiversity. As Indigenous peoples, we thrive by observing our surroundings. We know how to learn our environments and to watch for patterns within those environments. Each year we have attended the UNFIII, we observe the pattern, Global North fighting to continue this legacy of power and control. We have watched them push for supposed solutions, such as REDD, or now, as they say, nature-based solutions, carbon markets, carbon offsetting, and other greenwashed so-called solutions, such as geoengineering. As my colleague Aklasia Ramasuk states, climate solutions are not preventing sea ice loss or reflecting sunlight. We do not address climate change by treating our land and waters as carbon sinks or building man-made structures to sequester carbon. These show that Western science narrowly focuses on the symptoms of climate change, leading to a cycle of running to the next emergency, attempting mitigation, not meeting the threshold, and starting over. Focusing on mitigation and not the root cause, like the burning of fossil fuels, is deadly and is a compromise we cannot afford. True and sustainable solutions do not lie in a university or a laboratory, but in relationship with your community, local organizations, and the Indigenous peoples on whose land you reside. False solutions such as carbon market schemes and so-called technology such as geoengineering continue the legacy of using Indigenous lands, bodies, forests, and air as sacrifice zones. Now companies are pushing to use whales as offsets, and we have a side event about that tomorrow across the street at the church center at 1. These offsets violate our sacred relationship with whales, as do the forest offsets violate our sacred relationships with our forests. This also becomes a property right issue. This is both a land and ocean grab. Keep in mind that for-profit companies are still permitted to mine and drill on offset lands. The continued theft of Indigenous lands and Indigenous rights is simply continued colonial legacy. What we are observing is the violation of Indigenous peoples' rights as sovereign nations, the violation of the sacredness of Mother Earth by continued commodification, whether by the extraction of fossil fuels or by the designation of her body and surface as storage facility for our carbon. Protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and our lands would protect us all. In these spaces, I have observed the proposed narrative that engaging in carbon markets is an exercise of tribal sovereignty. But in the spirit of free, prior, and informed consent, I wonder if Indigenous peoples would exercise the right if they were truly informed about the detrimental impacts of those practices. If tribes were made aware of just how much lung disease, cancer, birth defects, missing and murdered Indigenous persons they were agreeing to place on Indigenous peoples in other places by signing over lands to offset emissions, would they still agree to it for any sum of money? Overpollution, climate crisis, and the so-called solutions to address it permeates all levels of social justice. How we treat our mother is reflected in the outcomes of Indigenous peoples, particularly our women and our gender diverse. We know that with large-scale infrastructure of carbon capture facilities will lead to the continued capture and murder of our women, just as it will justify the continued extraction and violation of our sacred Mother Earth. The statistics show that with man camps, the rates of domestic violence and sexual assault increase, and for generations we have observed that law enforcement was never made to protect and serve people who look like me. The attempt to manipulate the ecosystems we are in relationship with also violate the sacred and come with a host of concerns from Indigenous peoples. So some of these technologies, I'm just going to list them off, and I'm going to talk about a couple of specific projects that we've come into contact with. Carbon dioxide removal includes carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and ocean fertilization. Carbon capture and storage supposedly sucks carbon out at source, condenses it into liquid form, and transfers it to a site for sequestration. The problem is carbon is extremely corrosive. It only takes a little bit of moisture to help it eat away at the container it's supposedly sequestered in. And when it comes out, it expands into a gas. One such occurrence happened in Mississippi in August 2021. People in the area continue to experience health impacts from this to this day. Carbon sequestration is ineffective and a health hazard. The infrastructure needed for this techno fix is not possible economically or physically. And no CCS project has ever met its targets. Yet our governments and fossil fuel companies continue to invest in this so-called technology. Why? Carbon credits, offsets, net zero. 93% of the carbon captured in the United States alone is used for enhanced oil recovery, where they flush out nearly depleted oil wells with carbon to get more oil faster. Russ George, who has run many failed businesses and schemes in ocean fertilization, spoke to the Alaska Senate about dumping millions of tons of iron ore into the ocean off the coast of Kodiak. The last time his experiment happened, the number of toxic algal blooms increased, causing shellfish poisonings in Alaska. This is just another form of geoengineering technology being tested off the lands and in the water in Alaska. So solar radiation mitigation or management includes stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, microbubbles painting surfaces white. The theory is that you can reflect sunlight back into space because somehow the sun, our source of life, is the problem and not the extractive industries. Ice 9/11, now known as Arctic Ice Project, deployed football fields worth of synthetic hollow glass microspheres to attempt to thicken the ice in the Arctic without free, prior, and informed consent of the tribal governments and community members in Utqiagvik. The person who founded the project had spent decades before this contracting with Chevron. Scopex of Harvard University, which has actually recently ended, attempted to deploy weather balloon testing over Sami territory without free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples. This project was funded by Bill Gates and would support research for a technology meaning to spray sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. By their own computer simulations, this would disrupt monsoon cycles, cause drought in the Amazon rainforest, would disrupt crops, and would deplete the ozone layer. So I was actually in a webinar with the principal investigator of that research project, along with a couple other scientists, and they discussed the open letter that the Sami Council had put forward asking Harvard to stop the project. And in that webinar, the outcome or the argument against that was that this technology has a global interest, and therefore it would be wrong for Indigenous peoples to ask them not to test on our lands. The existence of racism means that Western-trained scientists and Western institutions who often have the power to develop global climate policy believe that Indigenous peoples are simple-minded and do not understand science. It means they also have an unconscious bias towards Western values and Western priorities. Their internalized supremacy-rooted beliefs lead them to argue that Indigenous peoples do not have the right to say no to geoengineering testing, even if it's done on our own lands, waters, bodies, and air. Their internalized superiority leads them to sincerely believe that their interests are global and therefore should supersede the rights of Indigenous communities to sovereignty and free, prior, and informed consent. We're here to tell you that Indigenous peoples have an inherent understanding that the commodification of life has failed us, including which is permitted through carbon offsets, biodiversity offsets, and other market-based mechanism schemes to prolong the fossil fuel era. We have an inherent understanding that testing single-dimensional research areas like feasibility and short-term ingestion toxicity in laboratories is simplistic. You cannot predict how large-scale deployment of carbon reduction and solar radiation management will impact complex interdependent ecosystems. Not involving those who are among the ecosystems is not only disrespectful and racist, it's foolish and dangerous. Testing whether a material will thicken the ice does not consider how spreading materials over 100,000 square kilometers of ice will impact the life system within that ice, which depends on sunlight and the delicate freeze-melt cycle of the Arctic. Indigenous peoples are not permitted to give adequate intervention on the subject within the framework of our own belief systems. We wade through scores of academics, institutions, and policymakers who try to suck us into irrelevant debates, such as the pros and cons of geoengineering. We need a permanent moratorium against these false solutions. We need protections against dangerous geoengineering, both in testing and conceptually as research. We need protections for our bodies, lands, forests, oceans, and animal relatives such as whales. We need an equitable and accessible grievance process. We are not here to debate. We're here to assert the relevance of our own cosmovision, our own science, and our own indigenous sovereignty and rights.
Thank you for that very important intervention. I'm going to have a series of questions for our speakers, and I'm going to ask a question of Tamara. You wrote in one of your papers about carbon markets are increasingly being referred to as a solid source of climate finance. I clipped that because I believe that's a really good question right now. A lot of our people are tempted as Indigenous people, not only of the South, but the North, that there's money to be made that will help us either to protect our forests or that we can play a part in being a climate protector. And you wrote that the relationship here is still one of extraction. Institutions that engage in climate finance, mitigation, adaptation finance, loss and damage, and the banks choose projects based on their ability to generate profit and maximize private sector involvement. And you said climate change is simply treated as the newest arena for capitalism, financial expansion and development, once again entrenching the dynamic of exploitation and violence from the global North under the guise of helping the global South. Can you spend a couple minutes just doing a deeper dive on speaking to that? Thank you, Tamara.
Yeah, thanks, Tong. I'm happy to know someone's reading some things I wrote. That's great. Yeah, so this is sort of an emerging narrative that we hear in the negotiations of Article 6, is that carbon markets can be seen or used as climate finance. And there's a few sort of areas that are important to break this down or criticize this with. And one is just around climate finance in general. So I'll kind of start there. After World War II, Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and the IMF sought to finance infrastructure projects in developing countries in order to, what they said, stimulate unidirectional growth economy to sort of look like the West, as if that was possible, but also, you know, to alleviate poverty or but ultimately to push countries into international capital markets. And the result of this has been unsustainable debt among some of the world's poorest countries, notably in Africa, and unsustainable debt systems because the goal of creating financial systems is to turn a profit. This is not free money. These are loans. They're attached with, you know, different types of agreements, and huge percentages of that have to then be paid back through these big IFIs. The 21st century debt crisis that we're looking at right now sees developing countries increasingly borrowing from hedge funds, from the non-transparent world of atomized private sector investors. And that, and a lot of that is used to prop up, for example, retirement funds in the global north or other types of funds that benefit the global north. So we see this flow of money sort of moving towards the global north again, and raw materials being mined and pulled out of the ground and forested and deforested, and those materials going to the global north, but the debt and the problem remaining in the global south. And this leaves countries managing today multiple lenders with rising interest rates instead of funding education or healthcare or even climate programs. So these are the same institutions that seek to gain from the climate crisis, the World Bank and others. They are, and they've been doing this for over 20 years. The World Bank was the institution that, quote unquote, launched the CDM, or the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. It was the same institution that stepped in and said, we're going to launch RED in 2007. And it is the same institution that now is housing, temporarily, we'll see, the Loss and Damage Fund. So, it's there's no reason to suggest at this point that the Loss and Damage Fund, with the World Bank as its trustee, will do anything different. The underlying function of global finance leads to inequality. It leads to poverty. It leads to land grabbing, ocean grabbing, as Punanga pointed out. It leads to pollution, extraction, combustion, and it leads to debt. Financing are not direct funds. These are very different things. Note the language. Financing are not direct funds. They're different things. You hear the word financing, we hear the word mechanism, and we must automatically understand that someone is expecting to turn a profit. Carbon markets in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and RED+, which is housed in Article 5 actually, are increasingly being referred to as climate finance. And this is hugely problematic for a couple of reasons. One, it sets up developing countries for failure because they're banking on, the nature of how carbon markets benefit from extractive industries in the global north. And they're banking on boom and bust cycles, which means the value of those are going to go up and down. And who do you think is going to profit when the value goes down? Well, these companies know how markets work. You buy low when the value's low, and you sell high and you turn a profit. But those who are involved in the markets or have given their land for this do not profit more or less. They've already signed a contract. But fundamentally, I want to say that carbon markets do not hold the global north responsible or accountable for its historic responsibility to the climate crisis. Carbon markets, as what's seen as a climate finance, really, they don't hold the global north responsible for colonialism or the legacy of colonialism that impacts Indigenous peoples all over the world today. So I just want to finally, point out that blindly pushing for finance from the same institutions that have caused the climate crisis will only expand an already unjust and colonial system and disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples. Instead, strategies should foreground and center Indigenous peoples' sovereignty, jurisprudence, territorial rights, demarcation of ancestral lands, traditional Indigenous knowledge, debt cancellation, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and true reparations for Indigenous peoples. So that is why we're here today, to call on a permanent moratorium on climate false solutions and debt-causing financial mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. I could speak to these things for days. But my next question is towards Alberto Salamundo, our human rights and rights of Indigenous peoples expert. I'm confronted in many different pathways as I talk to politicians, not only in the North, but the global South. Talk to representatives of governments, talk to large NGOs that have their teams pushing these false, agendas. And some people that I would say are friends and say, I hear you, Tom Goldtooth. I hear you, Indigenous Environmental Network, of your concerns, of the risk that's happening. Like I said, 20 years that we can't deny the evidence and the studies that are coming up that these climate fault solutions do not cut emissions at source, and even using harsher words and terms like scams and lies. How do we pursue a truth in capitalism? It's climate capitalism. And what's pushing it is money. So that we are tempted as Indigenous peoples in our leadership as we're trying to find money to survive, to where these false solutions are used as a form of temptation, with promises, often promises that never get delivered. So preventing human rights, we have done interventions around that as a result of carbon trading, carbon markets, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, RED plus, conservation realm, even using soils, sequestering carbon in the soil. So our small farmers are tempted to say, we're going to take money to keep the carbon in the soil, that we're part now of helping to address the climate crisis. But where in FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, are people fully informed of the depth, going into the weeds of what carbon markets is about? So with this question, we get pushback, yes, that there's going to be safeguards. Don't worry about it. There's going to be safeguards to prevent human rights violations. So I'd like to ask Alberto, what do you think about safeguards? Are they a solution to fix the problems that we are talking about? And there's a lot of discussion besides safeguards is being able to appeal decisions that are going to be made under Article 6 and grievance mechanisms. How do we trust a system that has never benefited us as Indigenous peoples? Alberto, are there safeguards?
Well, I think we're here because they don't work. I think if they worked, we wouldn't be here. We'd be home enjoying ourselves. The fact is that a lot of people are misinformed as to what they're doing, what the oil industry is up to, and what the banks and insurance companies are up to. This is too big a scope. Human beings tend to deal with what's immediately around us, for the most part. But no, they don't work. But I think one of the things that has attracted me to IN for a long time has been that we go to the communities that are in struggle, and we support them to the best we can. We raise their issues. We give them an opportunity to raise their voice, to come to these fora and find out that there are people living under the same conditions of oppression and colonialism. And so it gives us a chance to network with people. It gives us a front, let's call it a front, to try and withstand, to try and push back. I think when we go to traditional communities, like in Alaska or some places like that, where people are concerned about their well-being, about living on the land, about using the land for their own sustainability, and really keeping a balance between the needs of the land, the needs of the environment, and their own needs, and seeing themselves as we see ourselves really as one element in the web of life. We're not a dominant element, but we are equally, our existence is equally the same as a chipmunk or a squirrel we all have a right to be here. And we need to maintain that balance between ourselves and our four-legged relatives, or the ones that crawl, and speak for them as well. I think that there's a great movement going on about the jurisprudence of indigenous people about rivers having their own identity and having their own life. And rivers are alive, and they should have their own personalidad jurídica. I forget how to say that in English. Their own identity, their own ability to defend themselves, and that we can raise the issues within our legal systems with regard to their viability and health. So there are movements throughout the world that are really in tandem with ours. I think things are growing. We used to be. I'd like to reflect that when I joined IEN, it was 10 years ago. We were kind of like on the fringes. I mean, we talked about Father Sky and Mother Earth, and people say, "Oh, how folkloric, how nice, isn't that sweet?" But now, youth in particular are agreeing with us. We're an endangered species, just like whales, just like caribou. I mean, and we need to defend ourselves. I think what really is very promising for me, and very, I think I'm going to. Well, it's just promising. I think is the manner in which youth, and this includes non-indigenous youth, have accepted that reality. And for them, it's their life is at stake. It's their future. It's their grandchildren and children and grandchildren that are going to deal with even more dire climate consequences. So I think that kind of a movement, I think there's more and more realization that that's happening. I think that we're beginning to really, our alliances are growing. We do have alliances with non-indigenous peoples groups that are really very productive and very forceful. I think the Global Forest Movement. I don't know. There's all kinds of keep polluters. What was it? Keep polluters out. Kick polluters out of the UN. So I am very hopeful. I really am optimistic that there will. I mean, it is going to be up to us, but I think our youth are going to see their way through to really make a dent in this capitalist, colonialist world.
So I want to respect the time that we have been allocated for this 1:15 to 2:30 side event. So we've been organizing here at the 23rd session. We have many other indigenous organizations that are supporting us in our demand of the permanent forum to strongly recommend to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank for a permanent moratorium on all carbon markets and offsets, as enshrined in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, including carbon dioxide removals like carbon capture and storage, forest, soil, and ocean offsets, nature-based solutions, biodiversity offsets, and other geoengineering technologies, including debt-causing financial mechanisms, because they're all linked. We are now hearing that the UN and the International Monetary Fund and polluters like oil companies are turning whales and buffaloes and other sacred forms of life into carbon credits for the carbon market and greenwashing. Mother Earth and all life needs to be protected, not a resource to be exploited and commodified as natural capital. Thank you very much. We have booklets over here that are available in different languages that's available for you that go into a lot of depth on a lot of these false solutions. People here are available to talk with you now, but we're going to conclude our panel presentation now. Thank you very much.